indoctrinated by the world around you. When he says don't be conformed, he's saying resist the indoctrination. None of us have a single choice about that, do we? We're indoctrinated from the time we are born. We're indoctrinated into something in school and religion and everything else. And everybody's doing the best they can, but nonetheless, we are being formed by the way we're growing up, the institutions around us. But Paul says this, that's going to be a reality, but don't become so well adjusted to it. Don't be so indoctrinated by it that you fit into it without even thinking. That's the problem. Because when you dine on, let's just say, the talking heads, you begin to fit into it without even thinking. And that's what Paul's talking about. The talking heads will be there. The news will be there. But don't fit into it. Don't be indoctrinated by it and pick up an attitude that causes you to have hard feelings and enemies. He says, but instead, listen, look at this. Be transformed, be changed by the renewing of your mind. A statement I think I made it up. I really do. Years ago was the renovation of the imagination. That's how we're changed. Did your imagination just go somewhere when that song was being sung and you're reading the words? I mean, did your imagination take you to a place where that could be you? Speaking about the end of life and having no hard feelings and no regrets. Could that be you? Do you have an imagination for that? I hope so. Because that's how we are changed into the image of Christ, is by the renewing, the renovation of our mind and imagination. So that what? So that you may prove what the will of God is. And listen, this is so important. We have an obligation to undergo a change. Metamorpho is the Greek word. It means that whole thing from caterpillar to butterfly. We have an obligation to change, and when we cooperate with God under the power of God, it finds expression in our character and our conduct, and we're not the same person anymore. And we prove what the will of God is. This transformation is by the renewing of the mind. I love that phrase, the renovation of the imagination, because it'll change the way we think about the world, the way we think about ourselves, the way we think about God, and the way we think about other people. It implies that there is waiting for each one of us a new, fresh way of living this life. There's a new, fresh way of seeing God and seeing the world in all of its loveliness and all of its ugliness, and still proving what the will of God is. But what is the will of God? In Colossians chapter 1, verse 9 and 10, the same apostle says this: "For this reason, since the day we have heard of it, we have not ceased to pray for you." This is Paul praying for his friends in this church in Colossae that he had planted. He says, we haven't stopped to pray for you, and we ask that you would be filled with the knowledge of God's will in all spiritual wisdom and understanding. Now, if you just want to blow past that, it sounds very churchy, doesn't it? But you want to know what it means? He says, I pray that you will be filled, that you will be overwhelmed with, overcome by the knowledge. Now, in the Greek language, gnosis is seeking to learn. It's knowledge. I want to know this, I want to know that. But that's not the word used here. It's epignosis, and it's not seeking knowledge. It is participating in it. He says, I pray for you and ask that you may be filled with the participation and experience of the will of God. And you know what the will of God is? The word for will is thelema, and it does not mean the predetermined, resolute thing of God, like I will do this or I won't do that. That's not what the will of God is. You know what thelema means? Thelema means the gracious design that God has designed for us to live. Now think about it. I want you to be filled with an experience of the gracious design for humanity that God willed from the beginning, which would have been what? No hard feelings, and I have no enemies because I just live a life of love. And there's nothing else more important in the entire world than this right here. That is the will of God. And if you know that is the will of God and you're living in that gracious design, who cares who you marry? You have. It's got nothing to do with any of that. It's got everything with being a different kind of human being. He says, I want you to be filled with that experience, personal experience of the gracious design of God in spiritual wisdom and understanding. You know why he says spiritual? Because there is worldly wisdom and understanding. And that's what we get indoctrinated in. Worldly human wisdom is mental excellence. I can explain everything, and therefore I need no one. I can't explain anything anymore. Can you really? I just can't. Nothing makes any sense these days. So it's not mental excellence in the worldly sense of wisdom that I need. It's not worldly understanding that is the ability to just simply think clearly and coherently. I think pretty clearly and coherently most days, and I still don't like what I think. But when he says spiritual, what is he talking about? He's talking about this. I, as a new creation in Christ, have the mind of Christ. And now I have been upgraded. My human wisdom becomes spiritual wisdom because I have the mind of Christ himself. And if I pay attention to that, I will indeed become a different person. Understanding. My understanding has been upgraded. I'm thinking more clearly and coherently. And I'll go ahead and say it. I don't always like what I'm thinking because I'm not able to control the world through my worldly wisdom and understanding anymore. It's still the world. And yet, I'm a new human being with a new capacity. With the mind of Christ, I can be filled with not an experience of the gracious design of God that humans were created in. And then he goes on and he says, so that you will, read it with me, walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, to please him in all respects, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God. It results in a life that goes on and on and on. Walking is peripateo. It means right foot, left foot. But I'm walking, I'm living in a way that aligns with the will of God, the gracious design of God for human beings to live. Don't we already intuitively know? I mean, you don't need some preacher to tell you when you're not aligned with the gracious design of God in your life. Do you need anybody to really tell you that? That's why we don't spend any time up here pointing fingers at people. What's the point of that? We already know where we're not aligned with the gracious design of God in our lives. There are areas we all have. We know it. But it's supposed to result in a life that reflects the beauty of God, that brings God pleasure. And he says when we do that, we will continue to be increasing in the experience of God. So, be transformed. Be changed. That implies that we're probably being conformed. I think I realize that more now than ever. If you don't pay attention, you're going to conform to the world and its ways. You just do. I forget that old saying, if you never stand still, right? You're either going or you're falling back. So we're either being conformed to the world or being transformed. This week on a trip to wine country, we played bocce ball. Anybody ever play bocce ball? What a great Italian game. All you Italians know we got bocce ball, don't you? So nobody in the group knew how to play, so I trained them. But I didn't know how either. I sort of remembered, and so I vaguely remembered the rules. I gave some instructions. I explained. They accepted the rules without critically thinking about it. They said, well, that's the rules, that's the rules. And so we let it go. And it was a blast because we all played by the same rules. Whether they were right or wrong, we all played by the same rules, and we had fun. But just suppose That's the inventor of bocce ball would have showed up. I think his name was Guillermo Bocce. I just made that up. I don't know. But what if he shows up and he says, you got it all wrong? You conformed to Phil's thinking. You're missing out on the way the game's supposed to be played. You might be having, there's so much more to this game. So, instead of conforming to his thinking, why don't you be changed by having my mind? I invented the game. Could it be a better game if you play it the way I designed it? Of this game. This stuff, and they apply it to spiritual life and all that. That's all cool. But I found one that's really interesting. In fact, I learned it from my son. And did I give you guys the words to that? I think I did, didn't I? Let's put them up there. Yeah, okay, so here it is. This is from a book called The Critical Journey. So here's what happens. We have an encounter with God, number one. We get excited because we've encountered a spiritual being that we didn't know anything about. So what do we want to do? We want to learn. And so we call that discipleship. We'll do classes, we'll do small groups, home groups, all that kind of stuff. We do whatever we have to do. And then we realize it's not just about us. So we go into this other stage of faith where we're actually serving other people. And those are all really good things, right? All really good things. And then in stage 4, there's something that can happen to you. You start to question some things because in your encounter with God, discipleship, and serving, you start realizing there's some attitudes and stuff in me that's really, the Spirit of God is starting to speak to you. And it's called the inward journey. And eventually what you do, if you want to keep going down that road, you run into a wall. Get through that wall, and then you will see some lasting change. Now listen, you don't just do this one time, by the way. This is a lifestyle. We have to live this way all the time. The wall takes many shapes, but it's always the place of being face to face with God. The wall is the place my will meets the will of God. And I'm not talking about just deciding what house I'm going to buy. I'm talking about my will for the way I live my life. When it comes face to face with the gracious design of God's will, God's gracious design for the way I live, we're face to face now. And that's why a lot of people don't get through any walls. But that's where change happens and faith